and welcome to the Linux Spotlight. This show is dedicated to showing off the best thing about Linux, our community. This community is made up of developers, distro maintainers, YouTubers, and everyday users. Each one plays a vital role in our community, and the goal is to have a discussion with each individual about their journey into Linux and beyond. So join me now as we turn the spotlight on. Hello, I'm your host, Rocco, and with me today is our special guest, Alan Pope. How are you, Alan?
I'm very well, thank you, Rocco. How are you doing?
I am doing awesome. I got coffee, so we're good to go.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
All right, you don't need any introduction because everybody knows who you are. You have a presence on pretty much every platform out there. For the one person that doesn't know who you are, who is Alan Pope personally?
You're very kind. I don't see myself as any kind of celebrity or anything, like Z-list internet nerd celebrity or anything.
You're at the top of the list, dude.
Oh, you're too kind. I'm just some guy who uses Linux, and I've been using it a fair while. And I started contributing to my favorite Linux distribution. And eventually that led me to getting a job working on that distribution. We'll probably talk more about that later. And I'm quite keen on engaging with people in the community, because I know what it was like when I was not being paid to do this. And I know how it feels to be ignored. And I know how it feels if you want to contribute to something and you don't know where to start. You know, I've been there. And so I find it important to engage with people wherever they are. And that's why, you know, when you say I'm everywhere, that's why you see me on, you know, Twitter and Mastodon and Discord and Telegram and Matrix, because that's where people are. And you've got to go where people are.
Right. Exactly. Well, you work for Canonical as your day job. So your job description kind of changes every once in a while. So what is your job description right now?
So today, my you know, it may change at any moment.
It may.
So, I mean, we joke about it, but at Canonical, it's quite a flexible company. And so people can join the company doing one thing and move into another role. You can move from one department to another. You know, you can pretty heavily change what you do inside the company. Obviously, that doesn't work for everyone. You know, if someone works in the legal department, they're not suddenly going to become a kernel developer, and vice versa, right?
Right.
But generally speaking, it's pretty straightforward to move around. And since I started at Canonical, I've had 4 or 5 managers across different teams. And some people might think that's, oh man, that must be difficult, like moving around all the time. But actually, it's really good. It's really like refreshing to be able to not be doing the same thing all the time, like still working for one company, but moving around and having different responsibilities and different tasks to do on a regular basis. So I can be one day being a community manager, and then move to managing a team of app developers. And now I work on Snapcraft as a developer advocate. So they're all public facing roles. You know, I'm not hidden in a dungeon writing C++ or something like a developer. They're all public facing because that's a skill I have. You know, I'm quite good at talking to people. But they're like different parts of the company doing slightly different things. So at the moment, my job title is developer advocate on Snapcraft.
Well, I think that is a great piece of a company. Like for me, that's a perfect scenario where you could do different things, where you're not locked into one thing. But let me ask you, which one do you think has been the hardest?
Well, they're all challenging in different ways, right? I think the app developer one, we were building up a phone platform from nothing. So we were building up the Ubuntu phone, and we needed a set of core applications like the calculator, calendar, a music app, all the things that you want on an absolute bare bones default install on a phone.
Right.
And that was hard to spin that up, like a dozen applications that all needed to come out of nothing. There were a few bits and pieces that we could take from other open source projects, but it was, built mostly from nothing. And a lot of it was a community of developers who were building it. And we would give them some direction, like our design team would say, here's what it could look like, here's what the application might look like, and here's our visual style guidelines. But you're relying on people spending their own time actually developing the software. And so that was hard, managing that. And, we've got a deadline to try and get a phone out, and we're relying on the goodwill of community members who want to contribute to these projects. And so that was a difficult challenge. And more recently, working on Snapcraft, it's got a lot easier over the last 6 months. But I think probably 18 months to 2 years ago, it was quite difficult convincing people that snaps needed to exist. And that's still sometimes a problem now.
It is.
But that's a challenge. Is when people have their own understanding of how the world exists and how the world works and why are you coming along and moving my cheese and what do you think you're going to achieve by changing this thing, and you're just changing it for the sake of changing it, and you're just changing it because you want to take control, and all these other phrases that we hear day in and day out. We heard it a lot a couple of years ago, and countering that with solid arguments as to why this thing should exist, why I'm advocating for it, why I think you should use it, and how we can improve it. Those kind of conversations, they can be tricky. And so I think those are probably the two most challenging things over the last 8 or so years I've worked at Canonical.
Well, I don't envy your position, because that is a huge challenge. Look, in the Linux world, people don't like change. Well, in the whole world, people don't like change, but especially in the Linux world, they don't like change, and anything new is going to be met with a ton of back and forth of, does this really need to happen?
I don't know. I think, balance that with the flip side of that argument, which is every 6 months, Ubuntu puts out a new desktop release and people moan that there's not enough changed in there. Where is the middle ground here? Don't change anything, because if you change stuff, that's bad. But also, you haven't changed anything. That's bad. And so, somewhere in the middle. But the tricky part is people have their own perception of what needs to be done. And you can show off a new wallpaper, for example, as we recently did just a couple of days ago. And people respond with, oh, you should fix power management. It's do you think that the guy who made the wallpaper is also the guy who does power management? Do you think we can just pick that person up and move them to another role? That's not how work works, right? So yeah, that is challenging. It is difficult when people have a kind of quirky understanding of how change works. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, they want you to change the things they care about, each individual. So
sure.
All right. Outside of Canonical, do you have any hobbies?
So it's weird. When I was at school, and we used to talk about careers, and I'm going through this at the moment. I've got a 16-year-old daughter, and trying to get her to articulate what she wants to do with her life, like any teenager is challenging. But when I was a kid and I was 12, 13, that kind of age, I knew I wanted to do something with computers. I wanted to be sat in front of a computer, either programming or managing or doing something with computers. And, dream job. Every job I've had since I left education, I've had some kind of responsibility for managing or orchestrating or designing or doing something to do with computing. So I'm quite lucky in that regard, in that my job is the thing I enjoy doing. You could take that to mean I don't have any hobbies, because my job is my hobby. I was working as an SAP consultant for a long time, and I switched to working at Canonical. I got offered a role at Canonical, and then the thing that I was doing in my spare time became my job. And like, how awesome is that? Like getting paid every day to do the thing that you really enjoy doing, tinkering with stuff that you love playing with. But that said, so yeah, I can sit, like today, for example, I was sat watching my son play, I think you call it soccer. He was playing soccer this morning, and I took my laptop with me, and I sat in the park watching him play football, and I was tethered to my phone, and I was doing development work. I was doing what some people would call work or my job on a Saturday, when really I could have just been sat there watching the football. But that said, I do a lot of that nerdy stuff in my spare time. I also like to play a lot of old retro games. So that thing behind me is a Piecade, which is like a arcade cabinet that lets me play old games. And there's another little device in front of it called a Clockwork Game Shell. This thing, which is like a bunch of emulators and ROMs and stuff. But it runs Linux. Both of these things run Linux.
Nice.
So I'm still, nerding out on stuff that I do on a daily basis, even when I'm playing games. So retro gaming is probably the thing I do most, and collecting old computer hardware. So it's all in the computing realm. I mean, I like cooking. I like going to the cinema. I like listening to music, but those aren't hobbies. Like my real hobby, like nerding out.
Well, I mean, that's a great thing to be able to, as you said, get paid for doing your hobby. And there's a lot of people that actually, once that happens, they no longer enjoy it. So for you to continue to enjoy doing that, that is great.
Yeah. And what's possibly weird for some people is I don't mind doing it in the evening. Like I know some people have a very strong separation between work and personal life, and they strive for a very strong work-life balance. And I'm sat watching TV with my wife, and it's trash on the TV or whatever it might be. I get my laptop out and I'll do a bit of coding, or I'll solve some problem somewhere, because I enjoy it. Like, some would argue, yeah, but you're working outside your core work hours. What you're giving the man some of your time. It's like, well, otherwise I'm sat here drinking a beer, watching TV, like creeping ever closer to the grave. Why don't I do something useful with that time? So, so I do. I do enjoy my job, and I enjoy like working on the stuff outside of my work hours as well.
Right. Well, working for Canonical, obviously everybody there, I would think, is receptive to Linux. But what happens when you walk out of work for the day? The people that you come in contact with, friends, whatever, are they receptive to Linux as well?
So I guess it depends on the social circle. It's interesting. It depends who you hang out with. So, for example, if I go to after work, I sometimes take my son to soccer training. I never talk about Linux to any of the other parents there, and we never talk about technical stuff. Like someone might ask, "Oh, you might know how to do this, Alan. How do I fix this thing?" Because they know I'm techie, and I might tell them. But at no point will I try and put an Ubuntu CD or a USB stick in their hand and say, "Here, try this." I'll never do that.
Why not? No, I'm just kidding.
There's this captive audience of parents who can't go anywhere because their children are playing football. That's a perfect market for me to sell to them. But I don't know that they don't seem. I don't think it's necessarily the right way to go. You kind of need to go for people who are already looking. Like if someone's already looking for something, they've got a laptop and it's slow or it's running Windows and they're not happy with it, whether it's like philosophically not happy with like the spyware or the proprietariness or whatever reason, or whether they just don't like it and they're looking for an alternative, help those people for sure. But I've kind of come away from the, forcing it down for people's throats and trying too hard to push people towards Linux. Because that often doesn't work, especially now where people use mobile devices way more than they use PCs, laptops, and desktops. Like most of my family, like outside of this house, my brother and sister, they use smartphones and tablets. Like my brother takes a tablet on holiday, and he uses social media and manages his photos directly on those devices. He just doesn't use a PC, and so it's I think there are certain people you could talk to about those things, but I don't think you need to be evangelical about it constantly to everyone you meet. So no, I generally don't have those kind of conversations. Now, if I go to an event, like a nerd event, then you can bet I'm going to be talking about Linux like 24/7 from the moment I wake up until I fall asleep. Because there are people there who are receptive to it. Or if I go to a hackathon or a hackspace or something like that, then yeah, totally I'm going to talk about it. But yeah, not to normal people most of the time.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree that and I will go so far as to say you'll never convince anybody to use Linux if they're not open to trying it or open to some issue they have with their computer. I have never been able to go to somebody unless they were looking for it, like you said, and say, you got to run Linux. And then all of a sudden they start, by the way, I should run Linux. No, that doesn't happen that way.
The flip side of that argument is like companies advertise on TV to get their brand and their product in your face so that the next time you think, I need a new lawnmower, you're going to think of that company or that product and buy that company's lawnmower because you've heard of it and it's in your memory. Advertising works, not necessarily getting you to buy that specific model, but keeping their brand in your mind.
Right.
And I certainly think we can do a good job of, letting people know we're here. If you're looking for this, like I'm not going to buy a lawnmower every day, but that one time I need to buy a lawnmower, I need to think about what the options are. And so for those people who are not thinking about this kind of thing every day, but when they do think about it, they should think about our product, our brand, or have heard someone else mentioned it because someone else that they know uses it. And so that kind of thing works. There still is a thing called Software Freedom Day. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Most people haven't.
Nope.
It happens in September, around about this time, 20th of September or somewhere around about there. And it's been happening for years. And the goal of Software Freedom Day was to have events all around the world. It's a global event. And in different cities, in different countries, you can find people organizing events where people get together, give talks, share their experience of using free software, not specifically Linux. It could just be advocating for the use of LibreOffice or open document formats or that kind of thing. But it's all about software freedom. And I remember back in 2006 going to a Software Freedom Day event in London. And we walked down one of the main streets in London on the weekend. And I had 300 Ubuntu CDs with me that they'd shipped to me. And we were giving these out to people and we were trying to figure out what the best line to say to people was. Hey, would you like some free software, free CD? Because people would just like walk past you. You know what British people are like.
Yeah, I know.
A bit standoffish, and we're not going to talk to you in the street. In other countries, it might have been more viable, but in London, it really wasn't very good. But those kind of events, those grassroots community events that get people together are relatively effective at raising awareness, but not necessarily at converting every person you see. Like all those people I walked by in the street, some of them may have picked up a CD that may have found itself in the hands of someone who wanted to use Linux, or it might have been thrown in the bin. I just don't know. And that still goes on now, but not quite so much. I think a lot of that advocacy towards using Linux has kind of lost some of its power. There's not a lot of people out there advocating for the use of Linux, which is a bit sad, but that's the way it is at the moment.
Well, I want to go back to something you said about like when you go to a conference or when you go to somewhere that people are open to Linux, that you talk about it 24/7. When I went down the South, I hung out with all kinds of different people, mostly Zeb, but I hung out with all kinds of different people. And the greatest thing about it was that you could talk to that person normal as anything about what breakfast you were having. And in the same sentence, you could switch it to Linux and they would completely understand what you were talking about.
Yeah. When I was, when I first started going out, there's a big pub culture in the UK. And when you get to that age where you can start drinking, people often socialize in pubs. And I would go out with my friends and they would talk a lot about football. And there were a couple of us who would talk a lot about computers. And anyone who's not into computers, it's an incredibly boring subject. Like, I don't know. I don't know what other parallels there are, but if there were all of you going out, like half a dozen or a dozen of you going out on a social night, and two of the people there were constantly talking about structural engineering and wouldn't talk about anything else, and all they talk about, you'd probably get annoyed. So I kind of empathize with them. I was passionate about computers at the time, and one of my friends was, and we'd talk about like new technologies and interesting things that are coming up. And I'd actually get a yellow card from a friend or a red card from a friend to tell us to shut up about computers. And that's because my friends weren't into it. You know, they would talk about football or they would talk about, you know, something else. And I slowly distanced myself from those people because while they were my friends and I grew up with them, the fact that I can't talk about a thing that I'm passionate about just kind of upset me and made me think, well, I'll find someone else to talk to. And I started hanging out with people from Linux user groups and, you know, other tech circles. And I just started hanging around with different people because, yeah, when you go to an event like that, there are, you know, it's your people and those people understand you and they're happily talk to you for hours about, you know, network protocols or, you know, disk subsystems or, you know, all manner of stuff. I love going to these events because there are people there with diverse opinions on all things tech. And there's a common language. You can all talk about this stuff. And I love that.
Yep. It was absolutely a great time. Let me switch gears a little bit here. Let's go back to your original start in computers. So what was the first computer you had or saw?
So the very first computer I had was a Christmas present in 1981, I think, or 1980.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm old. It was a Sinclair ZX81. And for those who don't know, it was a small computer that had a Z80 microprocessor and had 1 kilobyte of memory in it, which was, you know, pitiful. And it had a basic programming language on board. It was made by a company called Sinclair, and they made a series of very popular computers in the UK. They're kind of comparable with Commodore and Atari, but where Commodore and Atari were super popular in the States, you know, Sinclair and Amstrad were very popular in Europe. And I remember my dad bought this ZX81 for me for Christmas. And I've got an older brother and sister, and they had whatever presents they had. I've got no idea. But my dad had it hooked up to the TV because he realized you can't do anything with this computer until you've typed some code in or loaded a program or a game in from cassette. And so he sat there very early on Christmas morning typing in a program out of the manual or out of a magazine or something so that I would have something to immediately play with. Like, it's like buying someone like a Game Boy with no games. Like, it's like, great, but I can't do anything with it. It would be like that. And so he sat, and I wasn't allowed in the room that the TV was in. And that kind of sparked my interest. And my brother and sister used to hate the fact that I would be on the computer because I would monopolize the only TV in the house, you know, with my computer nonsense. But eventually they bought a second TV. We bought a second-hand TV off of a neighbor. And I was sat in the kitchen with this gigantic cathode ray tube TV about this far away from my face with this tiny little ZX81. And then I moved through a bunch of other computers. But yeah, that was my first computer, and I absolutely loved it.
So is that first experience what got you into, you know, the development area, or did you go to school for this, or what?
So I had a succession of 8-bit microcomputers through the 80s. I left school in 1988, and my mum really wanted me to go to university, and I just didn't. I didn't have a good time in the education system, and I kind of didn't want to stay there. But she convinced me to go to a technical college in our local town, and I did a 2-year computing course there, where we we did some programming and some architectural stuff, but it was like the first level. It wasn't a super intense course. It was called a national diploma over here, and I did that for 2 years. And at that point, I was done with education. I didn't really want to do any more, despite my mum's protests and her wanting me to stay on and get further education and then maybe university. I'd had enough. So I got a job, and my first job was being like the office dog's body for computers. I would change the printer toner. I would change tapes in the mainframe computer. I would change the paper in the printers, and I would run month-end jobs on the computers and stuff. So it was a real like entry-level job in computing. There was no programming involved in that. It was mostly, office admin type stuff, like setting up new PCs for people, replacing network cards when they break, and a bit of wiring here and there. But that was my first job out of school, out of education. Was a local company that needed someone to just do all the menial like computer work, changing tapes and stuff like that. But it was fun.
No, I was going to say, even at that, I'm sure it was fun. I'm sure it was interesting to you to be there.
I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. It was, I had a PC on my desk. So this would have been 1990. And I had a MS-DOS PC on my desk. And I think by this time I'd gotten a PC at home. Interestingly, there's a YouTuber called LGR, and he recently did a video about an Epson PC from the past, and it was around the same era. And I looked at it, and I thought, oh my gosh, that is the PC that I had in 1990. And so now I'm on eBay and I'm looking for, this PC that I had, 20 years ago or so. And so I'm looking to get another one of those Epson PCs. But I did start doing some coding. I taught myself a few things. I taught myself Pascal, and I bought a floppy disk, which I got through the post. So pre-internet, getting software for a PC was a fun experience. You'd get a little printed catalog, which had a list of all the different floppy disks with all the different software you could buy, and a little order form at the back. And you fill in the numbers of all the floppy disks you want and send that off with your money. And then a few days later, you get a little jiffy bag come through the post with all of your floppy disks in, containing all your software. And I remember buying a Pascal compiler. I thought, I should get into some programming again. And because my job didn't really have any programming, and I quite enjoyed it at college. So I bought myself a Pascal compiler, taught myself Pascal, and taught myself a few other programming languages. But I've never had any, going back to your original question, since college, I haven't had any formal training in programming. And I always tell people I'm not a developer because you may not have any formal training in it. Yeah.
But you are a developer.
Yeah. I've written some stuff.
See, more of a developer than I am.
Well, yeah, I try not to elevate my status to that of developer, because people have preconceived ideas about what a developer is.
Right. And
I don't see myself as that. Like, if someone said, could you write a program to do this? I'll be like, maybe, I don't know. I can read other people's code. I don't often write my own.
So do you still have any of those floppy disks?
There is a box just here with some 3.5 inch floppy disks in. Yes, but that's because I collect a lot of old computers, and some of them have floppy drives.
So you have these floppy disks. You have a PC. Where do you hear Linux for the first time?
So after my first job, I got made redundant. Unfortunately, the company moved to another part of the country, and they said, we didn't think you'd want to move. And they were right, I didn't. So I got made redundant after being there only 6 months. And then I got offered a job at the college where I previously attended as a student. And I got a job in the electrical engineering department as a technician. The role there didn't really involve computers, but I managed to make it about computers somehow. This department should have more computers. And suddenly, I became responsible for the computers in that department. And so at that point, there was a lot of setting up of stuff and setting up experiments for the students. And there were a lot of students that would come and go, and I got to know a fair few of them. And one of them came in one day. I think this would have been sometime in 93, 94, something like that, because I'm pretty sure I left that job in 94, 95. This guy came in and he had this big stack of floppy disks, and he started talking to me about this new thing. And I didn't understand it. And he mentioned it was Linux. And I don't know what distribution it would have been back then. Might have been Slackware, I don't know. But it was one of the very early ones, even if it was a distribution, or whether he just had a whole bunch of source code on floppies, I don't know. But he mentioned it and he said, "Oh, do you want a copy of it?" And I got on really well with the student. I was like, Linux, that's never going to go anywhere. That's a stupid idea.
Also.
Yeah. I do regret that, actually. I that's one regret I have, is that I didn't get involved in Linux early enough. I think it would have been fun back then to do the whole, building everything up from source earlier on in the life cycle. But maybe I wasn't ready for it, or it wasn't ready for me. I don't know. But at the time, I heard about it, but it wasn't for a couple more years when you could start buying CDs on the cover of books. That's when I started looking at it more seriously. But initially, when it first came out, I just thought it was ludicrous and nobody would use this thing. So don't ask for advice from me on anything, because I'm clearly wrong.
So you hear about Linux. At what point do you first try it on your own computer?
So I think I had a Pentium 200, and I went out and bought the parts to build my own PC, which was a 400 megahertz Pentium 3 or something like that, somewhere around about there. So whatever those ages of computers are, it was around about then. So I had two computers, and the one that I had upgraded to, the 400 megahertz Pentium, I'd put Windows on, and I thought, what shall I do with this P200 thing that I've been using for a few years, but it's getting a bit crusty. And I don't know what triggered me to do it. I think I must have heard about Linux from somebody again, and it triggered my thought to have a look at it. And I bought a book, and I think it was something like Caldera Linux was the first version I tried, and it was a big fat book with 4 CDs in the back cover. And I bought that book, and I put Linux on that machine, on that 200 megahertz Pentium, and was like, well, what now? And I got a VNC client on the Windows machine, and I think I hooked a network cable between the two computers, because I was at home and I didn't really have a network as such. And I put a network cable between them. I think I managed to VNC from one to the other, from the Windows machine to the Linux computer. And that blew my mind. The fact that I could have a window on my Windows machine that was running software on another computer, and stuff like X-Eyes and X-Clock and all the little X utilities. I think I followed a tutorial in the book that's here's how you can run X-based applications and stuff like that. So that was where it really got started, was Caldera, I think. Caldera Linux in a big fat book I bought, which probably cost me quite a lot of money.
Well, you mentioned about having that screen on the other, controlling the apps on the other computer. That's a good, when you're trying something for the first time, you think, wow, that's cool. Was there anything that you said, man, that's not so cool?
Oh, the fact that it was so painful to set up, back then. See, this is why I'm in a mixed mind about whether getting stuck in early on was would have been a good thing or not. If I'd started back in 93, 94, I would probably have just got frustrated and thrown the floppy disks in the bin. Right? I would have had no patience for it. But I think Yeah, I think that was the painful part was, why can't I just click a button and make the screen resolution bigger? Oh no, you've got to edit this file, which is read-only, so you have to use root to edit this file, and you've got to put mode lines. What are mode lines? And you've got to calculate these mode lines, and if you get one character wrong in the file, your X session doesn't start anymore, and so you've got no GUI. It's like, well, that's rubbish. So that kind of stuff, like the fact that, you had to manually edit all these config files to get the thing working. It was kind of fun, but when it broke, I used to get incredibly frustrated. And so I empathize with new users who come to Linux now and get those same problems. Like the one that I hate more than anything is you update something, reboot, and you get a black screen. Like if you can't get the desktop up, we have failed catastrophically. Like just doing a software update shouldn't catastrophically break your system, but we still do, unfortunately.
Yes, and the newer users to Linux won't have any idea of what to do in that situation.
But they've got the internet. I didn't have the internet back then. I'm sat there staring at a computer that won't boot. I'm like, well, all I can do is reinstall. I'm not going to go down the library and find a book that's got answers to all my questions. These people, like now, how lucky are they? They can do a search online, black screen after updating Ubuntu or whatever, and find people with technical answers, So, they're in a slightly better position. And even if they don't go online and search, they could probably ask someone who knows about this stuff, because the proliferation of Linux has meant that there are a lot of nerds out there who, through your social circle, you will know, who know about this stuff and who can, help you debug why this thing is not working. Whereas back then, it was like nobody had heard of it. And so there was nobody with the skills to debug it. So I think people are lucky now that they can get access to people and resources online that can fix their system. But I still think it's awful that we don't fail nicely all the time.
Yep. So you have this computer where you have one computer that has Linux on it. Does it stay on there? And you have the other one that runs Windows. So how long before you switch to Linux?
So skipping forward a few years, probably 97, 98 was when I switched full time, or mostly full time. Somewhere around about 98, 99, something like that. I'd upgraded a few PCs over the, migrate through the line, and the worst PC gets thrown away and the second best one gets Linux and the best one has Windows, right? That's how it worked at the time.
Hand-me-downs.
Yeah. And then eventually I started using Red Hat Linux, and then I was getting increasingly frustrated with what they call RPM hell, dependency hell, where it would be very difficult for you to resolve dependencies when installing software. You'd go and get a piece of software, try and install it, and it would tell you there's a missing library. You need this other package. So you go and hunt that down and install that. And that one also has another package you need. And that was really painful back in the day. So I was, at that time, I joined a Linux user group in my area. And there was a guy at my Linux user group called Hugo. And he said, oh, you should try this thing called Debian. It's way better than that Red Hat thing you're using. So I was like, okay, I'll try Debian. So I switched to Debian, and then I never had that package dependency problem anymore. And I really, really enjoyed Debian. And by this time, I started working in a different field. I was now doing SAP consultancy. And SAP is like business software made by this big German company. And one of the platforms that you can run SAP on is Linux. And so I got some more experience of Linux at work, which, supplemented the knowledge that I taught myself through learning Linux at home. And so by then, like 98, 99, something like that, that's when I switched. And I was using Debian at the time.
So do you use Windows and Mac still for anything? Or have you ever used Mac?
So I had a Mac for a while. We wanted a computer in the kitchen for the whole family. I've got 2 kids, and when they were young, they'd sometimes want to use a computer for, I don't know, Minecraft, or maybe they wanted to like look stuff up or play games or something like that. And I wanted something that would go in the kitchen of our house. And I wanted something that wasn't an ugly computer. I wanted something that looked nice. And at that time, Apple came out with an iMac. And the particular iMac, I think it was a 21-inch or something like that, but it fit perfectly in the slot in the kitchen underneath a shelf. And it was like, oh my God, this thing physically fits in that slot. That's the computer for us. And so we had a Mac for a while in the kitchen. Don't know how long that lasted. A couple of years, 3 or 4 years maybe, that lasted. And that was just so that if the kids at a young age were using a computer, they could be using it where we could watch what they're up to, because we're in the kitchen as well. So, we could make sure they weren't doing anything dodgy. And
good thinking.
So that's really the first Mac I bought. And at one point I bought an Apple laptop. Before I started working at Canonical, I bought a MacBook Pro, and I flipped backwards and forwards running Linux and OS 10, and then back to Linux and OS 10. And it never really worked properly, Linux, on that machine. And I got rid of that a little while ago as well. And after that dally with my Apple laptop, I said, I'm not having another one of those. And I switched, and I've now had ThinkPads since then. I do have Windows kicking around here and there because I love playing games, and some of the games I play only work on Windows. So I do have a Windows machine. This laptop dual boots into Windows, but I pretty much never use it. I boot up into Windows, and then it has like 1,000 updates to do. I've recently started using it to test some of the software we make that works on Windows. So, I have a justifiable work reason to use Windows. But yeah, I don't use Windows on a regular basis other than playing games, really.
Well, I mean, I'm in the same boat. So I have Windows dual booted on this machine to play certain games. I boot into it maybe once a week to play a game that doesn't run on Linux. So
yeah, it's getting fewer and fewer. And with things like Proton, there are games that I could only play on Windows, like No Man's Sky. I love that game. And I bought it when it first came out, and then I stopped playing it for a while. But I had a dedicated Windows machine for playing that with a decent video card. But now it kind of works in Proton. That means I don't need Windows for that game. But there's a couple of others that I play. I still play things like PUBG now and then. I quite like playing. And my son likes to play Fortnite, so we have a Windows PC for him to play Fortnite. So I think there's still a place for Windows as the game launcher operating system, but I don't really use it for anything else. I've tried out WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux. I've tried that out, but it's not a thing I need. So I don't use Windows a lot.
Right. Well, Battlefield 5 doesn't work on Linux currently, so I got to have a Windows machine around. Now, people would expect a certain answer out of this question.
Here we go. Just so everyone knows, I don't know what these questions are.
No, he doesn't know what these questions are. This is actually one episode where you don't have any idea what I'm going to ask you, except for maybe past episodes of what I've asked other people. So there you go.
I'm fine with that. Go for it.
All right. So on your computers, do you run one distro, or I guess the bigger question is, do you consider yourself a distro hopper?
No, I'm not a distro hopper. So I said, when my friend Hugo said you should try Debian, that would have been in late 90s, early 2000s. And then there was a point at which in the early 2000s, I was having real problems getting my webcam working on Debian. And I had a Philips webcam, and it was notorious at the time that the Philips webcam driver was a bit flaky, and you had to recompile it every time. It wasn't in the kernel, so you had to rebuild the kernel all the time. And I was sick of this. I thought, this is a new century. It's year 2000. I shouldn't be compiling kernels. This is nonsense. And I must have mentioned that or vocalized that at some point. And once again, Hugo came along from my local Linux user group. And he said, have you tried this new thing, Ubuntu? It's like Debian, but it's made to be easier. And I thought, I've never heard of this before. And this was in 2004, late 2004. So I grabbed an ISO and I installed Ubuntu, and I've pretty much had Ubuntu installed solidly since 2004, 2005. So like if I look around the room at the other computers in the room, this one I'm on is running Ubuntu 1904. That one is 1804. There's another one with 1904 and Unity. There's one over there that's using Ubuntu Mate 1904, and that's got Steam on it. And when I boot into Mate, it boots directly into Steam, so I can play games on it. So no, I very much don't consider myself a distro hopper. Distro hopping is a thing that I think there's certain subsets of people who distro hop. There are people who are reviewing these things as a service for other people, who are making YouTube videos, making tutorials, making documentation or whatever to say, hey, here's this new distro, or here's a version of a distro, and here's how it's different from other distros, and here's how it's different from previous versions of this distro, right? And that's one niche of people who distro hop. There's another niche of people who just use Linux as a hobby, and they have a main machine which may run Linux or it might not. It may run Windows, and they have other computers that they run all kinds of little Linux things on. They don't use it permanently, so they don't really care, and they don't mind wiping it and starting all over again and starting with a new distro and reinstalling. And I think that's another niche, is people who are just playing with Linux because it's fun, right? And I don't fit in either of those boxes. I use my computers, and the computer that I'm on, I'm using for my job. And so it makes no sense for me to keep switching out the OS all the time, because I'll never get anything done. I'll never have a consistent environment in which I can actually get my job done. And so I've just stuck on Ubuntu since 2005, and it's worked for me.
Well, you may not be a distro hopper where you change every week, but I've heard you before say like you are trying out KDE Neon. So there are times when you try out other distros, right?
Yeah, certainly. So I was the KDE Neon thing. I had this laptop and I traveled to, I don't know why I was in the States. There was some event I was in the States, and I was listening to Chris Fisher talking on one of his Linux podcasts, where he did this challenge of, try running KDE Neon, and he was going to do it. And I thought, yeah, I'll do that. So I'm sat at the airport listening to his podcast where he says he's going to try out KDE Neon. And I thought, well, I might as well try that too. So on the airport Wi-Fi, I tried downloading the KDE Neon ISO image, but the airport Wi-Fi was terrible. So I switched to using 3G, and I used the 3G connection on my mobile phone to download the ISO image directly on my phone, and then copied it via a USB cable onto the laptop, put it on a USB key, and then while I was on the plane on the way home from America, I installed KDE Neon at 30,000 feet, which was quite good fun. And, a little bit nerdy to do an OS install at 30,000 feet. And actually, I found a bug in the installer. And so I reported the bug after I landed, and they've now fixed that. But it was a useful thing to do, because I don't think many people do install operating systems at 30,000 feet. I think it's
not usually.
Yeah. So I found a bug that most people wouldn't have found, and they fixed it. And I used Neon, I think, for 18 months now. And then I switched back to Ubuntu for no other reason than, well, let's try this out and see what 1904 looks like. I also did it because I had an audio issue on KDE Neon 1804, and I wanted to really nail where this audio issue was coming from. I thought it was the software stack I had. So I thought if I upgrade everything, at least then I can file a bug and say, look, I'm running the latest version of everything. I've got the latest kernel, latest Pulse Audio, latest everything, and the bug still happens. Because if you're using something that's like 2 years old, people might say, well, could you please upgrade and see if it's fixed in a newer version? And I thought, well, I'll just get that out of the way. So I'm now on 1904 with GNOME Shell.
Very nice.
It's not to say there's anything wrong with KDE Neon. I love it to bits. I think it's fantastic. I just thought I'd try GNOME Shell for a bit.
Well, you mentioned podcasts, so let's get into podcasts. You're involved with, is it the longest running podcast in the Linux world, or one of the...
No, I don't think it's longest running. So yeah, I started the Ubuntu podcast with some friends in the UK Ubuntu community. I can't think how long ago this was, 11, 12 years ago, something like that. There are other Linux podcasts that predate us. But, 12 years is not bad. That's pretty good. We're on our 12th season. So we started in February, March, something like that. And we ran through till Christmas that year and then decided we were going to take a break. And so that was season 1. And so we then weren't sure if we were going to come back for a season 2. We'd done like 20 or so episodes. We weren't sure what we were going to do. And so we took a break. And then in February the following year, we went out for a curry because we're British and that's what we do. We go out for a curry to have a meeting. And so those of us who were presenters at the time, myself, Davey, Simon, Tony, and Laura went out for a curry and decided whether we were going to do another season. And we decided to. And so that's become the pattern now. We run from like February, March time until Christmas time, and then we take a break. And it's nice to take a break because then we can regroup and decide if we're going to do it again. And there's this long running joke that, they say they're not sure if they're going to come back, but they always do. Well, we might not one year, we might decide, well, I think we've had enough, we'll do something else. So yeah, that's the way that started is, we've had these 12 seasons, since whatever now is minus 12.
Well, 12 years is a long time running for a podcast, regardless of if it's the longest running.
Right.
What is the magic in Ubuntu Podcast that, podcasts come and go? You may be around for a year or two and then they just fade off. So what's the behind the scenes magic that allows you guys to stay together or keep it going?
I'm not sure there's magic, but there's a few factors. One is I always said from the very start that any one of us could leave and it carry on. Like it was always planned that we would use infrastructure that didn't rely on one individual, that it not be about a person. It was the Ubuntu community. And at any point, someone could decide they've had enough and leave, and somebody else could come in and replace them. And that's worked because at some point, Tony left, at some point, Dave left, at some point, Simon left, and Laura left. And we had other people come in to replace them. And so that worked, right? That was a fundamental part of it is anyone could leave. It's not these 3 people and it's these 3 people doing the podcast and it will only ever be these 3 people, right? It's always tried to be flexible. And I think that's helped it survive is because we planned with that from the start. The other thing is it's an Ubuntu podcast. We're not distro hoppers. All of us use Ubuntu, right? If any one of us decided to distro hop away to something else, like, let's say for whatever reason, I decided I don't use Ubuntu anymore. I now use Fedora. Then why would I do an Ubuntu podcast? Like that wouldn't make any sense. And so the fact that we all tied ourselves or hitched ourselves to the Ubuntu brand that we all like, that we all use, and that we all continue to use means that we survive. If we'd hitched our wagon to, I don't know, some other distro that has now disappeared, then, it wouldn't have been it wouldn't have the longevity, right? But because we hitched ourselves to what we thought was a sustaining Linux distribution, it kept us going.
Well, I think another part of that is the personal aspect of Ubuntu Podcast. So this is not just a we talk about Ubuntu and nothing else. Like, you guys talk about experiences you have. You talk about what you're currently working on. It has that personal aspect that people can come and more or less learn about you guys and what you're actually doing at that moment, which kind of gives it the flexibility of, hey, am I going to tune in to get the latest news of Ubuntu, or am I going to tune in to three guys that love talking about whatever they're doing?
Yeah, and we've had feedback from people who've said, our listeners who've, like, when we regroup at the beginning of a season, we ask the listeners, what should we do? Should we change anything? And we totally listen to the listeners. And, when they say to us, less of that, we don't like that, less of that, we'll put less of that in. Sometimes they say, you need to make it longer, or you need to make it shorter, or we need more episodes. And we tell them the practicalities of, we're all working people, we're in some cases parents, and we have other responsibilities. We can't just drop everything to make a podcast. This is as many episodes as you're going to get, right? You're not going to get any more of them. So we'll do the content that we think you want in that package of half hour, right? And so I think that's been a key part as well, is the fact that we engage with the listeners and, we listen to them. And if, like, one of the changes we made more recently was we had listener feedback that said, we actually really like that intro part where you talk about what you've been doing, as you mentioned, like the personal side. And we always thought that was just get people to know our voices, so that when I say, what do you think? And someone speaks, the listeners know who that is speaking. I don't have to say, what do you think, Martin? Like, they know it because it's an audio. You can't see their faces. And a lot of people say, myself and Martin sound alike, or myself and somebody else sound alike. And so that intro bit, it had a couple of functions. One was to get people to know the voices, so that later on they know who's speaking at various points in the show. But actually, everyone else who was listening was saying, we really like that bit where you tell us what you've been doing. It's an insight. It's a window into that world of, what you guys do at work, or, what you do in your spare time. And it's, people like engaging with presenters of these things.
Yep. Well, because it's not just, I don't want to listen to a podcast that I'm not interested in the person hosting the podcast. Like, right. When you're listening to something, you want to know about that person. Who is he? Like, what does he do? Like, what does he do in his spare time? Who is he partially? And that's what's awesome about the intro.
Thank you.
So you're also involved in another podcast called User Error. So tell us about that.
So that was so this is a Jupiter Broadcasting podcast, the network that have a lot of podcasts. And User Error is something that Chris Fisher and Angela used to do on a regular basis. And I'll be honest, I never watched it. It was a kind of random mishmash of stuff, of like various conversational topics. And I never watched any of the older episodes. And then Joe Ressington started working with JB, and he wanted to resurrect User Error, but with a different lineup, without Chris and Angela, with different people. And he approached myself and Daniel Foray from the Elementary Project and said, would you two guys fancy doing User Error? And we were like, yeah, okay. And it's kind of a Linux, the universe and everything is like the mantra. There's a bit of Linux. It's a little bit of like, philosophy, and then a little bit of random questions. And the idea is people can send us questions with this hashtag #AskError, and we'll answer them. And they go all over the place. Like, some of them are, related to distros and Linux, because we all have an interest in that, and a lot of our listeners do. But then they're like completely off the wall questions about all kinds of stuff. And yeah, like philosophical, legal, whatever it might be. But it's just the kind of conversation you'd have in a pub with some friends. We're not trying to teach you anything. We're not trying to like enlighten you on something. We're not even advocating the use of Linux. We're just talking about it. And so it's really just three friends chatting about stuff.
Well, that's the way it comes across. It comes across as three friends talking about whatever. It actually reminds me of a conversation you would have at a Self or another conference where it's, hey, 1 minute we're talking about the weather, the next minute we're talking about, legal advice, and the next minute we're talking about Linux.
Yeah, and it goes all over the place as well, like Linux, and then talking about, we try and get a bit of tech in there. So Joe asked a question recently about what sleep tech do you use? And we started talking about, are pillows sleep tech, or is, something that plays white noise in the bedroom sleep tech? And that's the other thing, because we have very different points of view on some of these things. We can have quite a lengthy conversation about something you really wouldn't think people would talk for more than 30 seconds about, which is quite good fun. I quite enjoy doing it because it's just, it literally is a chat with a couple of friends of mine. And I've met both Daniel and Joe a number of times, and the conversations that are recorded there are exactly the same as what we would chat down the pub. So, yeah.
Keeping it real.
Yeah. The only thing to warn people about is it can have quite a lot of profanity in it right from the start. So if you are considering listening to that show, it is very different from the Ubuntu podcast. The Ubuntu podcast we've always figured would be family friendly. Mm-hmm. There's no swearing, no profanity in there. And we don't touch on some tricky subjects in there. Whereas user error, there's no filter.
Okay, it's good. So let's go back to Linux a little bit. Do you have a certain workflow that you use, whether that be keyboard driven or whether that be a workflow of certain software you use during the day?
So I use GNOME Shell at the moment. I'm a big fan of what came in Unity in 2010, 2011. Whenever we landed Unity, I really liked Unity. At the time, it needed a powerful graphics card and a decent spec machine to run, and it needed all the bugs ironing out. And the early versions of Unity were not great, but towards the end of Unity, in like the 2014, 2015, 2016, that kind of era, I think Unity was a great desktop. I look at it now, if I have it running on one of my laptops, and the UI looks a bit dated. It needs a refresh, but unfortunately, nobody seems to want to pick that up, which is a shame, but maybe someone will in the future. But the reason why I'm mentioning that is because when Unity came out, that was when desktop user interfaces really embraced the whole search feature. So you just stab the super key, the Windows key, and then you search for what you want. You just type a couple of letters. So if you wanted to Firefox, you stab that button, press F, and maybe Firefox is the first thing that comes up. Press enter, done. You got Firefox launching. And I really love that workflow. I love being able to just press one button, start typing, because my hands are near the keyboard always. One of the reasons why my hands are near the keyboard pretty much all the time is because I use ThinkPads. And I love using the touch point, the little nipple nub in the middle of the keyboard.
Yep.
I actually switch off the trackpad on all my laptops. I don't actually use the trackpad.
You switch it off?
Yeah, it's totally switched off. So it freaks people out who come over and use my laptop. And like, I'm trying to debug something, and someone will come over and start trying to scroll the browser up and down. I'm like, no, that's off. I'm not turning that on. I actually turn it off completely. And even this computer here is an Entroware machine, so not a ThinkPad, but this is a ThinkPad keyboard plugged into it. So, even on computers that are not ThinkPads, I use ThinkPad keyboards.
Right. And
so having my hands on the keyboard with my finger on the nub means that keyboard is my workflow. Keyboard is predominantly my workflow, but because I've got my finger on the nub, I can do stuff like scroll really easily by using the middle mouse button and my finger on the nub. And so I embraced that whole search type functionality. And because Unity really pioneered a lot of that, and KDE now has it in Plasma, and GNOME Shell now has it. Every other desktop seems like Brisk Menu, for example. You press the button and start typing. That's my workflow. I have my hands on the keyboard predominantly. I do have a mouse plugged in, but I almost never use it. In fact, the only time I ever use a mouse is when I'm playing games.
Well, I mean, I have a similar workflow where most of the time I just want to use the keyboard. And I love GNOME Shell as far as being able to just hit the super key and have a full screen menu, and I'm partial to a full screen menu. So although I have to say that, that I'm the one that killed Unity, right?
Uh-oh. Really?
So I had never liked Unity. I tried it one time, and I'd never liked it when it was in its heyday. And then one day I finally said, you know what? I'm going to put it on this machine and see how it is. And I put it on, and I don't know if it was me that changed or that it had just come along or whatever. And I just found it to be awesome. And I had never looked at it that way before. So I end up doing this whole video on Unity. And I think it was like the next day, Canonical announced that there was going to be no more Unity. That video never released, just so you know.
Is Mark Shuttleworth one of your video subscribers? It must be it.
That video never released. But I did find that the Unity launcher, even though it wasn't full screen, had that modern feel to it, rather than a menu.
5 years ago, it felt modern. It doesn't feel quite so modern now. But I used to get quite frustrated with people who would cast aspersions on Unity, because a lot of the comments that were made were like, oh, it's designed for tablets, or it's a touch screen user interface. It's like, use it for a day and you'll realize it absolutely isn't designed for touch screens, because it's all keyboard centric. Even to the point when you first log in, you get punched in the face with a dialogue that tells you, here are all the keyboard shortcuts. It actually tells you what they all are, because they're important, and it makes it faster to drive Unity. If you want to open an application, super A. You want to open some music, super M. You want to open a file, super F. Or if you want to search everything, just press the super key and start typing, and it'll find your files, your music, your applications, whatever it might be.
Yep. Like I said, I to the point where I ended up installing Umix OS on the machine I had.
Oh, is that the Umix, the Unity?
Yep. And that I enjoyed running. So
yeah. Well, like I say, I've got Unity on my ThinkPad X220, and it's 1904 running stock Unity from the archive. So all these claims that Unity is dead, and okay, it's it's a dead man walking. There's not a lot of activity going on it, but it is still in the archive. You can still install it, and it does still work.
Yep.
And that's the other thing, is when Unity came out, and we had a small subset of the internet who were, fervent haters of Unity, and they would tell everyone that they hated Unity. There was still a huge number of people who bought, for example, Dell laptops that came with Unity pre-installed. So if you think back to 1604, that's only a few years ago, that shipped with Unity. They sold tons of machines, and all those people out there running Unity were perfectly happy running Unity, right? We know that because we interact with these people. And there's a small subset of the internet that feel compelled to tell the world when there's something they don't like, right? I don't care. If there's some random dude on the internet who doesn't like a piece of software, it doesn't matter to me. Use something else. Use whatever you want. If you found KDE is better for you, use it. It doesn't affect me in any way. Just use what you like. You don't have to go around telling the whole internet how terrible a piece of software is just because you personally don't like it. And then when we killed Unity, a whole load of people came out of the woodwork and said, hey, what are you doing? We love this thing. What? Oh my.
I was one of those.
What do you do?
Look, you're never going to please everyone all the time. No, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
So speaking for you personally, is there any software that's not available on Linux that you'd like to see come to Linux?
Well, I mean, I think there's two answers to this. One is just more software, because I don't necessarily want to pick on one piece of software and say, well, Photoshop would be great, or, Adobe After Effects or something. Yeah, I'm sure that would be great for some people. I just want more of everything. Like, I want that feeling that you get when you browse the Google Play Store, where you can scroll through categories and there's tons of stuff in every category. I want that. I want lots of diverse software. I want software for people who live in Brazil that has Brazilian-centric things. I want software for people in India that has India-centric things that I will never install because I don't live in either of those countries. I want software that's designed for children. I want software that's designed for, older generations. Like, I just want more of everything. And that's hard. We're trying to motivate people to make software for Linux, but it's hard. So that's one side of it. I just want more of everything, right? So there's more choice, more diversity of software in all of the app stores, wherever they may be. But the other exception to that, and the one thing that is like specific examples would be the developer tools. The developer tools that you get on a Mac are really great, like Xcode and all the stuff that goes with that to build Mac applications don't exist on Linux. They don't exist on Windows either, but this is one of the reasons why developers buy Macs. Like, a lot of the time, people complain about, why do I go to a conference and I see all these developers are using Apple Macs? It's because they have to. Like, you can't build software for Apple Macs and for iPhones unless you've got an Apple device, right? And so telling them to go out and buy a Dell XPS or a ThinkPad is no good, because they can't do their job without an Apple Mac if their job is to develop software for an Apple Mac or for iOS. So I would say we need those developer tools on Linux. And if I could, make a wish that, Apple made all this software open source, Xcode and all their developer tools, and bring it across, yeah, that would be one. And the similar from the Windows side, like a Windows developer could use Visual Studio and all of the tools in Visual Studio. Bring that across to Linux, open source it all. I mean, we've got the cut down version, VS Code, but the full Visual Studio, bring that across to Linux. So a developer can get a Dell XPS 13 or a ThinkPad or whatever laptop, run Linux on it, and then install their developer tools and use their developer workstation. So those are the two sides of it. There's two specific applications I would go for: Xcode and Visual Studio, but then everything else as well.
Right. Well, I would add to that something like Easy Anti-Cheat for games that run. That is the biggest stopper for most games or most AAA games, I should say anyway, for coming over to Linux, is because of that anti-cheat that's not available in Linux. So I would add that to the list.
Yeah, that's a big one. But there's a whole bunch of middleware. Linux gamers kind of get angry at developers because a particular game hasn't been released for Linux, and there's a whole myriad reasons why that happens. EAC is certainly one, but there's other middleware that they use. Like, it may well be that the game is written in Unity, so theoretically you could press a button and spit out a Linux build, but there may be some other middleware they're using that relies on Windows, in which case they can't just spit out a Linux build. And so it's very difficult. You can pick away at EAC and say, that needs bringing over, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that, would enable a whole bunch of games as well.
Right.
I think actually Proton is helping to make that less of a problem, obviously.
Yep. What do you think is the biggest barrier to software being? Is it money? Is it the idea that Linux or open source software people won't pay for actual software?
Well, It's a good question, and there's a couple of answers to that. One is people don't buy software anyway. Like these days, you buy subscriptions. Like nobody buys Spotify, the app. You pay a subscription to Spotify. Nobody buys Slack, the app. You pay a subscription. So, and the same thing with Skype. You don't buy Skype. All these pieces of software are free in terms of, you don't have to pay for them, but there's some kind of subscription that goes along with them. And that's pervasive across the industry. There are a large number of applications that a lot of people use. I know this isn't the case for all. It's a generalization, but there's a large amount of software which you don't pay for, you pay a subscription for. There is a notable exception to that, and that is games. Games generally are you pay for the piece of software and you download it and then you run it and you can keep running it because you paid for it once. There is a slight exception to that in terms of DLC and some games which have a subscription service. But there's this separation between apps, which are generally going service model, and games which you pay once for and maybe get some DLC later. But oftentimes you don't. You just pay once and that's it. And so trying to get developers to bring their application to Linux isn't about, are they going to buy my application? It's, are they going to pay for the service? Like, so if you speak to a prominent software developer who has an application in the Windows Store and an application in the Mac Store, and you say to them, you should port your application to Linux, they'll ask, how many people are going to subscribe to my service? How many people are going to give me money that makes it worth me doing this? And some of those companies already know the answer to this because they've tried in the past. And so they know that there's a very small percentage of the market that uses Linux. And so naturally, there's going to be a very small percentage of those people who are going to subscribe. And is the revenue that we get from those people going to pay for the development time and effort to port my application to Linux and continue to maintain it? It's not a one-time thing. You don't just port it once and you're done. You've got to maintain it because libraries need updating, features need porting, and so on and so on. And, we've had conversations with prominent software developers. And when we say to them, we'd like you to make a snap of your application, for example, they will quite candidly say to us, Linux is 1% of the market. We know this. You have 1% of my time, or you have 1% of my attention. What are you going to do with that amount of time, right? And you've got to be brutally honest with the listeners and the audience. You are a very small subset of people on the planet, and a developer has a fixed amount of money that they can spend, fixed amount of resources they can spend on development. Do they add more features to their application, or do they dedicate someone to port their application across to Linux, which has an audience of 1%, maybe less? Are they going to make enough money to do that? And for a lot of them, the answer is just no. And that's a brutal reality of where we are in Linux. And I think we need to be honest about that, because we can't go around telling everyone we have all these millions and millions and millions of users. They know what proportion of the market Linux is, and it's vanishingly small.
Yep.
It's a negative way to think about it, but you've got to be honest, because, and this is why you see like some game developers have decided to drop Linux, because they know there's not a huge number of them out there. And it's a shame, but that's the world we live in right now.
Well, I wish I could say at some point we're going to change this. And, with things like Proton, we're gaining ground. So maybe this, just starts out as a small snowball and rolls into something really big where we can just continue the growth.
Right. And, there are people doing great work. I'm not dismissing the work that developers on Linux are doing. Like, you look at the work that Elementary are doing to try and bring applications to the Elementary Linux desktop. You look at the work GNOME Foundation are doing. They're going to be running a contest soon, which has significant monetary prize to bring new applications to Linux. And KDE has the backing of a private backer who's giving them money to fund development of Plasma and Plasma Mobile and all these other cool things. So they're all doing great stuff. But developers have made a choice. And much as people hate this, there are way more people writing applications in Electron than there are making GTK and GNOME apps or KDE Plasma applications. And so developers have made this choice that they're going to make their application in Electron. They're writing it in JavaScript, they're using Electron, and that's how they're going to make their application. And that makes it a lot easier to build a version for the Mac or to build a version for Linux. And that's what we've been doing. We've been approaching those developers because these are people creating new applications. And I appreciate there are people in the Linux world who hate Electron applications with a passion, right? What do you want us to do? Like, there are developers out there who are making new software. Would you rather we brought that software across to Linux so that more people will be enticed to run Linux because there is software for them to run? Or would you rather we shut the door and say, no, you can't bring your Electron application to Linux because there are people over here who think that's an aberration and that you shouldn't have Electron on Linux and you should only have pure GTK applications or pure Qt applications? Well, if you're going to go down that road, we will always be 1%.
Yep. I mean, I've heard people say, you mentioned a piece of software. Oh, that's just an Electron app. Well, regardless, it allows me to use the app. I mean, it doesn't bother me what the back end is as long as I'm able to use the app. Let's talk about the community for a second. The community is something that I think is the best thing about Linux. But what is it that drives your passion for Linux itself?
That's a great question. I think it's because I enjoy using it and I feel like other people are kindred spirits and they will enjoy using it as well. I feel like there are people out there. Well, I know there are people out there. I don't have to feel it. I know there are people out there who enjoy using this as well. And it makes me want to make things better. I want this to be better. I want more people to use this, and I want those people to enjoy using this. And so that's why I want to continue working on this. Like, the very first contributions I ever made to open source software was not development. Remember, I'm not a developer. It was actually doing support. One of the jobs I had back in 2006 or so, it was a contract, and I was just babysitting a system at a company that was shutting down. So I had no new work to do. I just had to keep the systems running. And that was, basically feeding it coins every so often. And that was it. There was real no work to do. And I got bored. And so I would go and answer technical questions in the Ubuntu community because I had nothing else to do. I would just stare out the window all day. So I started doing technical support because I wasn't a skilled developer. And I would sit there answering question after question after question. People would, ask, how do I get my Wi-Fi working? Or my husband's got this music notation software and I want to get it working on his computer. How do I do that on Linux? And I would answer these questions. And I spent a good, 6 months solidly answering technical questions. And you can see all of these questions and all the answers I gave because they're all archived in Launchpad. If you go to launchpad.net, I think it's answers.launchpad.net/Ubuntu or something like that, and search for me, you'll find all the questions and all the answers that I gave back in 2006. And I enjoyed doing that because I was solving problems for other people. Like, someone had a computer, they wanted to get on the Wi-Fi. Their goal was get on the Wi-Fi to use my computer. And the Wi-Fi was blocking. And so I would solve that problem for them. And usually it was just a case of doing a bit of Googling or, finding the right piece of documentation for them and providing in a human readable form. And so I felt that was helping. Like, all I was doing was interpreting something a developer had written and turning it into something a human being could read, right? A non-technical human being could read. And I would paste it in the answer. They would read that, they would understand it, and they would hit the little button that says, this answers my question. And every time they did that, I got points called karma on Launchpad. And I clocked up like 1 million points of karma on Launchpad just through answering people's questions. And it was so rewarding to solve problems for new users. And that's what got me in, was just answering people's questions. And to this day, I still, if I'm bored and I'm not doing anything, I'll sit in the Ubuntu IRC channel, or I'll go to askubuntu.com, or I'll go to any one of a number of other places where people ask questions. I go to where they ask questions and I answer their questions, because who else is going to do that? Like, who else is going to provide technical answers to new users' questions? And I think that's on us, because we've already trodden that path, right? We've already figured out how to get that AMD video card working, or we figured out when there's this conflict between these two pieces of software. We know the answer to this. Why are we holding it in our head and not sharing it with other people? And that's, I'm not a good developer. I'm good at explaining to people how to do stuff. And so I'm just doing what I'm good at. And so explaining stuff to people. And that's what makes me get out of bed in the morning.
Awesome. I love it. So what would you say to somebody now that wants to get involved in helping out? Where would you send them?
That's a great question. And the answer really depends. I think one of the things we try and do is we pounce on people who are new and we push them down the wrong path. We kind of need to get into the mind of almost doing like an interview with someone and finding out, what do you like? What are you passionate about? What are you interested in? And I think people are more likely for their wheels to line up and get in the right rut and go the right path if we like set them up for success in the first place. So like from my background doing support stuff, I find telling people, well, if you're not a developer and you're not particularly adept at writing documentation, why don't you just answer some questions? If you're already knowledgeable about something, answer questions about that thing. Like if you go to Ask Ubuntu, there are tags on questions. So if you know all about the networking side of things, just search the networking tag and answer just those questions. You don't have to know about Pulse Audio if that's not a thing that you know about. If not a thing you're passionate about, don't answer those questions. So find out if people want to do a bit of support. If their passion is preciseness and quality, then maybe they could do testing. Maybe they could look at existing bugs that people have reported and figure out if that still is a bug. Like the bug that somebody reported a year ago, does that still happen? If not, maybe ask for some more detail. Does this still happen? Try it out yourself. Close bugs if they're no longer apply. A bug closed keeps a developer happy because it's one less thing they've got to care about, right? So closing bugs is just as useful as solving bugs. Maybe it's just a case of you testing stuff out. Maybe writing documentation is your thing. Like maybe you really like writing guides, in which case find documentation that doesn't look right and fix it. Stuff like that. The amount of contribution you could do to Linux is really broad, and there are so many different places you can get involved. You really need to find a thing that you like doing. And what you've also got to remember is it's your time you're giving. You are spending your limited number of hours on this planet to contribute to something. So use that time effectively. Do something that you really like doing. Otherwise, you're just going to, not want to carry on doing it. Like the only reason I continued doing support is because I liked it. And if someone said, well, what we really need is someone to write code, I might have had a go, but it would have been a hard slog. And, trying to say to people, you need to do this. I want you to do this. You're not going to have success. You've got to find out what people are passionate about, find out what they want to do, and let them try a few things before they settle down on a thing that they like doing and that they're happy giving an hour or two of their time every so often to do. Because, we're asking for the most valuable thing people have, and that's time. Everyone's got a limited amount of time on this planet, and we're asking them to donate a chunk of their life to this project to make it better so that the next person who comes along behind them has an easier time than they did. And that's quite a lot to ask of someone. So I think we need to be careful about trying to push people in the wrong direction and push people to contribute to stuff that they're not passionate about, and try and guide people to something that they enjoy doing.
Well, you've been around the community for a long time, so you've had to see some of the not so friendly reactions to newer users or questions that people have asked that, maybe they got the RTFM or whatever. But what can we do to make that whole experience for these for everybody, not just new users, but for everybody, better?
So I find this funny whenever I hear about the whole RTFM. What you're explaining here is that there are people in our community who are abrasive to new people, right? Why are we putting people who are abrasive to new people in front of new people? Why are those people doing that job? Why are they not working on something else that doesn't mean they have first line contact with users? There's a reason why when you go into an Apple store, there's a friendly face there. They're not going to put the most sour developer at the front of the shop to greet new users and new customers as they come in through the door. You want a friendly face, right? And that's implemented. They didn't just randomly pick some guy and put them at the front of the store. They make sure they've got the right skills for the job. And so I would say you put the people who have the right skills in front of new users, not the people who are abrasive, difficult, throw an RTFM out there and, just Google it and throw you a link and hope you figure it out yourself. Don't put those people in front of new users. The way we did this in Ubuntu was, from very early on, we had a code of conduct. And within our communities, we ask people to abide by that. And that really makes a difference. In the Ubuntu IRC channel, we try really hard to guide people to solutions without just throwing a link at them or throwing a, RTFM. In fact, RTFM is not allowed in that channel. If you say RTFM, you'll be told that's not support. That's not helpful. Try, understanding what the problem is and articulating a solution that doesn't involve pasting a URL, actually guide them. And so I think really you need to be brutal with those people who are doing that and say, you're not representing my project. You're not the kind of person that I want to put in front of my customer. You're not the person that I would want to put at the front of the store. So when a new person comes in, you are the first thing they see, right? That's the simple thing. You just move them onto something else. Like maybe you should be writing documentation. Maybe you should be coding. Maybe you should be doing QA. Maybe you should be doing anything other than being the face of the project.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great solution. Although that's not going to help in like a forum situation. Like if you're on a user forums and you get people responding in that way, they might not even be involved in the project. They just might be a user that's not so friendly. Right.
But all forums have moderation. They all have tools that you can use. And if the rules are spelled out, RTFM is not allowed here. Please be respectful. Here's our expectations. Here's what we think are reasonable behaviors. And if you don't like that, there are other forums. The internet is a massive place. You can go somewhere else, right? There are plenty of other places you can go. But you don't have to stay here. If you don't want to follow the rules, go somewhere else. It's as simple as that.
Agreed. Absolutely agree. You've been working on like troubleshooting issues for a long time as well. Do you have what was the biggest problem that you ran into that you solved?
That I solved.
That you solved.
I'm not sure I would class them as big. I mean, you can class them as important. So some time ago, there was we had this thing called Ubuntu Phone. You may have heard of,
maybe.
And at some point, someone managed to put some malware inside an application that was uploaded to the store, and I think it was done as a proof of concept. It didn't really do much. I think it changed the boot splash screen on the device. If you installed this application, it would change the boot screen and put a piece of text on it or something like that. It wasn't malicious. It didn't send your data somewhere. It didn't harvest bitcoins on your CPU or anything like that. And I spotted that it was doing it, and did some investigation and some debugging, and I ripped apart this application and I alerted people inside the company that this was happening. And there was, a quick call with the security team, and there was a quick call with the people who manage the store. And we pulled the application down, and we banned the user's account, and we monitored that application, and we tried to figure out how many people had got it installed. And, we reacted really fast. And I think that we've done 2, maybe 3 times. I think we've had 3 things where something malicious has happened, where I've been involved. There are plenty of occasions where, malicious stuff gets stopped at the door and doesn't actually get in. There's a couple of occasions where things have leaked through and we've had to deal with them. And I think those are the ones where I feel a tremendous amount of success is, you could say it's a failure that they got through, but there's security holes in everything. Not everything is perfect. Something got through. We figured out what it was. We debugged it. We shut the door. We stopped any more users being impacted. And in some cases, we repackaged the software, removing the malware, and uploaded that to the store so that if anyone had installed it, they would get an update that would uninstall the malware, right? So we did preventative measures to fix the problem for all the users that might have been affected, however many there were. And I think that I find a tremendous amount of reward from, because it's not like there's ever going to be a public blog post that says, hey, Alan did this thing, because it was a collaboration between me and security team and the store team and developers. And there's a whole load of us involved. I feel a personal sense of success that I work for a company who are all willing to mobilize as soon as there's something which could adversely affect users. One of the occasions I was sat at a football match watching my son play football, and I noticed something, and I was on my phone and pinging the right people and phoning the emergency contact number. And, because we all want this thing to be a success. None of us want users to be adversely affected. And because we're all super passionate about it, we all jump on these things immediately. And people will, we'll get someone out of bed, or we'll phone the emergency line in order to make sure someone can resolve this problem. And that makes me very proud of Canonical and proud of Ubuntu that we do that. And my tiny part in those successes, I feel quite proud of.
Well, that's definitely something to be proud of, dude. Anytime that you are helping users out, even when they don't maybe even know or appreciate it, right. That's an awesome thing.
Right. The malware that got uploaded to the store, it was a game, and it had a bit of malware in it. I mean, lengthy argument about whether it's malware. It's a crypto currency miner thing. We ripped that game apart, removed the malware, and re-uploaded it to the store under the same name. So any user who had that malware would get a software update that removed the malware, and they still had the game installed, right? And there weren't many people who had it installed. It was a tiny number. But we, cleaned their machine for them remotely, effectively. We didn't reach into their computer and remove the bits from their computer, but we just did a software update that didn't have the malware. And that we agonized over whether to do that because, we're effectively doing a software update that changes the behavior of someone's system for the better.
For the better.
But, you gotta do the right thing for the end user at the end of the day.
Yep. That's definitely a fine line to be walked. But what do you think about when you hear that term, Year of the Linux Desktop?
I think it's a sad old joke that's, we trot out, every year. Maybe next year will be the year of the Linux system. Oh, I mean, I think it's just a funny meme. I think the funny thing is, once you look at the audience of Chromebooks and Chromeboxes, and you look at the audience of devices like these, like handheld devices that run Linux that sell thousands and thousands around the world, and the audience of Windows users who now have WSL, which means they have a Linux kernel on their system with WSL2 that's coming soon. I think we're already there. There are Linux machines all over the place. I don't think it matters that it's not punching you in the face with a penguin every 5 minutes to tell you, you're running Linux. It doesn't really matter. Like the fact that your set-top box, my set-top box under my TV runs Linux. Like, I have no visibility of that. There's some menu buried in there somewhere where I can read the GPL if I really want to. But, there's so many of these devices that are running Linux. Whether you opted to have Linux as a choice or that it just happened to come with it, it doesn't really matter. We're already there.
Awesome. I love it. Well, so if you could change one thing about Linux, what would it be?
Oh, man. Just one.
Just one. Just name one thing that you might want to change.
I would want to change the tribalism. I wish we could all just get along. I wish that, like when GNOME put out a new software release, like we'll go out of our way to promote it and talk about it and say how brilliant it is. When KDE do a new software release, we'll talk about it, we'll promote it, and we'll, say how awesome this is. I wish we didn't have this like beating of heads when people are like arguing about this thing's good and that means that thing is terrible. Both things can be good. Like it is possible for KDE to be good and for GNOME to be good as well. And it's also fine for XFCE to be good and i3 to be good. It's fine for all these things to be good and for no one of them to be like terrible, awful, why are you using that? Oh, you're a terrible person. Oh, you're one of that gang. All of that is just so tiresome. Like one of my friends, Michael Hall, used to work at Canonical, and he says, if you blow someone else's candle out, it doesn't make your candle any brighter. Like putting down another project doesn't make yours better. Just make your project better. And that makes your project better. Don't worry about other people's projects. Just get on and make your own thing better. And so, like personally, when we're working on stuff, like in my job, I work on snaps and snapcrafts, and we work on trying to make it better. We work on trying to fix bugs and make the experience better. And then you see conversations in the community about this versus that, and oh, that's rubbish. I only use this. It's like, okay, but you don't have to just like crap on all the other things because they're not the thing you chose, right? And I find that frustrating. That tribalism where people are like this versus that all the time it's really tiresome.
But you see it all the time in Telegram groups, in forums, and whatever. It's the first reaction that if somebody brings up something about, say, GNOME, their first reaction is not to say, this is a great thing or that's a good piece about GNOME. It's, GNOME stinks because of this. Mm-hmm. You should try KDE because KDE's way better in this. And it's like, you don't have to answer in that way. You know what I mean? It's okay to admit that there are great things about GNOME And there are maybe some things you don't like about it, but it's also okay to admit that there's some great things about KDE. You don't have to be a KDE person or a GNOME person.
Right. It's okay to not like things. You don't have to be about it.
Yes, exactly. All right. So you came to Linux a while ago. So thinking back on all the reasons that you chose to run Linux then, do they still apply today?
Yeah, actually. The reason I run Linux is because I like it. That's the reason I run it. Like, some people are like all about the philosophy, or, oh, I hate Windows because of spyware, and I hate Windows because of like DLL hell. That's an old one for old people. Or, I hate the Mac because Apple are awful and their products are overpriced and all this. None of that applies to me. I just like using Linux. And so I use it. Like, it's like, it goes back to this whole tribalism thing. Like, I bought a particular brand of toaster because I like the toast that it makes, not because I hate every other toaster. I bought this one because I like it, right? Similarly, the car I have, I bought because I like it, not because I hate every other car. It doesn't have to be about hate, right? And that's how I feel about Linux. I use Linux because I like using it. Like, if I didn't like using it, I wouldn't use it. It's stupidly simple.
Absolutely simple, and yet exactly the way it should be. You don't do that in any area of your life, as far as you don't use something because you hate everything else.
Yeah, I find it really weird. Like, computers are almost exclusively the only thing that people get. Well, it's not true. Computers, people get stupidly passionate about. You're this or you're that. You're Apple or you're Android. You're Windows or you're Mac. You're GNOME or your KDE. Like, it's this or that. It's your binary choice. You've got two options when nobody else gets a look in. And other things aren't like that. It's not, your BMW or your Mercedes. There are plenty of other options. You don't have to have one of those two. You can have one of the others. That's fine. And when I bought a fridge made by a company called Bosch, right? It's a nice fridge. I've never had an argument in the pub over the fact that I bought a Bosch fridge. Why didn't you buy a Neff fridge? Why didn't you buy this Smeg fridge? Why did you buy a Bosch fridge? Well, because it was the one I liked. I don't know why people get so ridiculously passionate about the electronics that other people have bought. It's really weird.
Well, I mean, it comes down to wanting to tell people, or maybe even wanting to elevate your opinion or your choice. You know what I mean? Maybe it's a idea. Validate. Yeah, that would be a better word, I guess. Validate your choice of what you chose to use.
Right. But the thing is, this may shock you. I don't care what you use. I don't care what car you drive. I don't care what fridge you have. It doesn't matter to me. Like, it doesn't affect my life. It doesn't affect my ability to chill vegetables, and it doesn't affect my ability to drive to the shops, right? My life choices are the things that affect those things, right? If you want to use something else, great. Isn't it great that there are all these options that you could choose from? Isn't that marvelous, right?
It is. I mean, it's simple, but that's just the way it is. All right, man. Is there anything else you want to share with people?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for setting up Biddle in the first place. I've said this to you before, and I don't know if many people have cottoned onto this, but in the UK, there has been a dwindling in Linux user groups. And as I mentioned earlier, I like to hang around with people I can talk to. I like to hang around with people who have similar interests to me. So I go on things like your video chats with lots of people, because there are lots of people there who I get on well with and I can have a conversation with, and we can talk about stuff, and I'm not going to get a red card for talking about computers. So I just wanted to thank you for setting that up, because that's like my Linux user group now. It's I have to get up at 2 a.m. to do it,
I'm sorry. There's just no good time to do it, man, for everybody.
I have to say that every time. But I enjoy it because there's a bunch of people in there who we can all have a discussion about stuff. And it's just like being down the pub, but I don't have to leave the house. It's brilliant.
Well, you mentioned that, and that's exactly why I enjoy doing it, is because I get to talk to people who I can just sit there and nerd out and talk about Linux or the computers or whatever we want to.
Yep. It's great.
How can people get in touch with you, Alan?
Oh, I'm pretty much everywhere as Popey. If you go to popey.com, somewhere there's a thing that tells you how to get in touch with me. But I'm twitter.com/Popey. I'm ubuntu.social/@Popey. Popey.com. Send me an email. My phone number is at the bottom of all my emails. Nobody phones me. So
you don't have a preference on social media or anything?
No, I'm pretty much everywhere. You'll find me on Discord and Telegram. Some places I'm Popey DC rather than Popey because Popey had already gone. The DC means .com. So
I love it.
So yeah, you'll find me everywhere.
Thank you, Alan, for joining me. It was an awesome conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, that's going to wrap it up. Thank you for joining us this week as we spotlight the best thing about Linux, our community. Until next time, long live Linux.
Automatic adjust volume. Yeah, I do. I'll turn it off. Sorry.
No, that's all right. Perfectly fine. It's just when you're talking, it's kind of lowering you, and so it's not going to be exactly the same. It's all good.
Run it through a compressor and it'll be fine. Not to have the microphone too much in my face.
But that's okay. I haven't found the perfect spot for it, so
like there.
That actually sounds good, but
yeah, it's like hello.
Yeah. All right. So just say something at your normal level.
So today I went to watch my son play football, and that was good.
Is that American football or
no, proper football?
Okay. All right.
With feet.
I won't judge you.
Well, they won, so whatever. That was good. I've had roles where I've done community management. I've managed a team of app developers.
Cool. That sounds really cool.
Sorry.